Imagine stepping into a room so silent that your own heartbeat becomes unbearable. Every breath feels obscene, every blink violent, every memory a sharpened blade. This is what patients of a Viennese doctor experienced in the 19th century, an experiment in fear where silence was a weapon and survival meant enduring your own body screaming at you. By the time they left, they were calm, obedient, efficient, but terrified of the dark, desperate for noise, chained forever to the absence of sound. What kind of man designs a cure that traps the mind in its own prison? The first thing taken was not dignity or freedom, but sound. Patients crossing the threshold of the clinic felt it before they understood it, a pressure in the ears, a wrongness in the air, as if the building had swallowed something essential and was waiting to see how long a human body could pretend nothing was missing. Footsteps landed and vanished without echo. Fabric brushed against skin without a whisper. Even the act of breathing felt exposed, obscene, too loud for a place that seemed to punish noise by refusing to acknowledge it. The clinic stood on a quiet Viennese street, its facade respectable, modern, and deliberately unremarkable. Inside, the smell of polished wood and antiseptic clung to the walls, layered over something older and colder, a mineral scent that suggested sealed rooms and long confinement. Corridors absorbed movement the way deep snow absorbs footsteps. Sound did not travel here. It was captured, dismantled, and erased. Patients slowed their pace instinctively, as though speed itself might offend the space. At the heart of the structure, far from windows and streetlight, waited the silent rooms. They were not padded, not visibly threatening. Their horror lay in precision. Walls met at perfect angles, surfaces smooth and undecorated, ceilings neither high nor low enough to invite relief. No clocks, no vents, no cracks. The doors sealed with a pressure that felt final, and once closed, the room did something subtle and irreversible. It removed reference. Without external sound, the body turned inward, amplifying its own signals until they became unbearable. The first thing most patients noticed was their heartbeat, not as a comforting rhythm, but as a presence. It thudded against ribs, echoed in the skull, crept into the throat. Blood seemed louder than thought. Swallowing became an event. Blinking felt violent. Time lost all familiar proportions, stretching and collapsing unpredictably, minutes smearing into something viscous and hostile. Panic arrived not as a spike, but as a slow saturation, soaking nerves until resistance felt pointless. The clinic's staff called this adjustment. They recorded breathing patterns, posture changes, the moment when fingers twitched without instruction and shoulders curled inward to protect organs that suddenly felt exposed. There were no screams. The rooms allowed none. There was only endurance, measured carefully, clinically, with the detached fascination of men who believed they were witnessing progress. Patients were told the silence would cleanse them. That fear required stimulation, and without it, fear would starve. What no one explained was that the human mind does not tolerate emptiness. Deprived of the world, it manufactures its own landscape, and that landscape is rarely merciful. Inside those rooms, memories resurfaced with surgical clarity, regrets replayed without distortion, and thoughts gained weight and texture until they pressed against the body like physical objects. By the time the doors opened again, something had shifted. Faces emerged pale and composed, eyes unfocused, movements precise and economical. Fear, as it had once existed, was gone. In its place remained something quieter and far more obedient, a vigilance that never slept, attuned forever to the danger of silence returning. Vienna in the latter half of the 19th century worshipped momentum. The city inhaled coal smoke and optimism in equal measure, convinced that science could sand down every sharp edge of the human condition. Electric lights crept into wealthy districts, medical journals multiplied, and men with precise handwriting and confident theories were treated as prophets. In this climate, the doctor did not need to exaggerate his brilliance. The era did it for him. His clinic was spoken of with a particular tone, one reserved for institutions that promised both discretion and transformation. Carriages arrived daily, depositing officers whose hands trembled despite polished uniforms, noblewomen whose grief had hardened into something unseemly, scholars haunted by thoughts that refused to stay buried. Inside, the building smelled meticulously clean, layers of ink, disinfectant, and varnished wood arranged to reassure visitors that nothing uncontrolled could exist within those walls. Every surface gleamed. Every corridor was measured. Order was not suggested. It was enforced. The doctor himself was unremarkable in appearance, which only amplified his authority. He dressed plainly, spoke softly, and never rushed his movements. His eyes carried the stillness of someone who had learned to wait without discomfort. He published relentlessly, filling academic circles with essays that framed fear not as an emotion but as an infection. According to his theory, fear fed on stimulation. Noise, light, social friction, unpredictability. Remove these, and fear would collapse under its own excess, devouring itself when deprived of external nourishment. His colleagues debated him publicly, yet quietly referred patients. The results were impossible to ignore. Patients returned changed, calm, focused, efficient. Panic attacks ceased. Night terrors dissolved. Compulsions loosened their grip. The city, intoxicated by outcomes, did not ask about the cost. The treatment was described as minimal intervention. No drugs beyond mild sedatives. No restraints. No physical pain. Only isolation refined to an extreme. The doctor argued that the human nervous system, stripped of all incoming sensation, would recalibrate itself. Sensory deprivation was not punishment, he claimed, but purification. What remained afterward would be essential, disciplined, useful. The silent rooms were the culmination of this belief. They were not improvised spaces but architectural instruments, designed with obsessive care. The walls were constructed to absorb vibration completely, layered with materials chosen not for strength but for muteness. Floors were dense and unyielding. Doors sealed not with locks alone, but with pressure differentials that erased even the softest tremor. When closed, the room did not merely become quiet. It became absent. Inside, patients were left with only what could not be silenced. The doctor wrote extensively about this phase, though his published works softened the language. Privately, his notes were more precise. He documented the amplification of internal signals, the way blood flow became audible, the way joints creaked like distant machinery, the way the heart asserted itself as the dominant presence in the absence of the world. He referred to it as the return to origin, the moment when the body stripped the mind of illusion. He believed this confrontation was necessary. Fear, in his view, was not an enemy to be fought, but a system to be redirected. By forcing the patient to experience their own physiological noise without distraction, he shattered the hierarchy of thought. Abstract anxieties collapsed under the immediacy of survival signals. When the heart thundered loud enough to drown out memory, fear lost its narrative power. It became sensation, and sensation could be endured. What he did not include in his public lectures was how long this endurance took. Hours stretched beyond recognition in those rooms. Without sound or visual variation, time fragmented. Patients entered expecting minutes and emerged after spans they could not describe coherently. Some swore days had passed. Others believed they had been forgotten entirely. The doctor watched this carefully, noting the exact point at which panic ceased to escalate and instead flattened into something colder. This was the moment he valued most, the threshold where terror stopped screaming and began listening. He observed posture changes through small, concealed apertures. Shoulders dropped, spines curved, breathing slowed, not from calm but from conservation. The body learned efficiency when overstimulated by itself. Muscles stopped fidgeting. Thoughts narrowed. The mind, deprived of novelty, turned inward until there was nowhere left to flee. When patients were released, the doctor did not comfort them. He offered no congratulations. He simply recorded outcomes. He noted how many steps they took before orienting themselves, how long it took for their eyes to adjust to sound returning, how their pulse responded to the reintroduction of the world. He paid particular attention to their sleep patterns in the weeks that followed. This was where his true interest lay. Patients slept, but differently. They avoided darkness. Silence became unbearable. Many left radios playing softly through the night or requested clocks that ticked loudly enough to be felt through the pillow. The doctor interpreted this not as damage, but as success. Fear had been displaced. It no longer fixated on imagined futures, but clung to the absence of stimulus itself. A manageable condition. A predictable one. In private notes never intended for publication, he wrote that a mind trained this way was permanently altered. It would seek structure, noise, light, reassurance. It would avoid extremes. It would comply. Such individuals, he believed, formed the ideal foundation for a modern society that valued stability above all else. Vienna applauded him. Invitations arrived from across Europe. The clinic expanded. Additional silent rooms were commissioned, each more refined than the last. And beneath the praise, beneath the papers and accolades, the doctor continued his work with meticulous calm, convinced that he was not breaking minds, but perfecting them. Fear, after all, had not been eliminated. It had simply been taught where to live. Inside the silent rooms, time did not pass so much as unravel. The absence of clocks removed sequence, but the absence of sound removed confirmation. There was no way to measure continuation, no reassurance that one moment had successfully followed another. Without footsteps in the corridor, without the distant cough of another patient or the scrape of a chair, the body lost its external anchors. What remained was duration without structure, an experience that stretched and thinned until it became something hostile. At first, patients waited. They sat or stood, expecting interruption, expecting the room to reveal its purpose. Many assumed the silence was temporary, a prelude to examination. Muscles stayed tense, breath shallow, attention directed outward toward a door that offered no response. When nothing arrived, the body began to fill the void on its own. The heart asserted itself quickly. It did not beat louder in any mechanical sense, but perception sharpened until the sound felt intrusive. The pulse echoed behind the eyes, in the teeth, along the spine. Blood moved with weight and insistence. Each contraction felt intentional, like a signal rather than a function. Swallowing became a conscious act. Saliva accumulated and demanded attention. Blinking disrupted focus and was therefore resisted, leading to burning eyes and blurred vision. Without sound to break continuity, thought began to loop. Memories replayed without variation, stripped of context and softened distance. Regrets returned with precision, sharpened by repetition. Faces appeared uninvited. Words once spoken resurfaced intact, complete with imagined tone and expression. The mind attempted to create noise where none existed, and when it failed, it turned inward with increasing aggression. Some patients paced, counting steps until numbers lost meaning. Others pressed their ears against the walls, convinced that some vibration must exist beyond the surface. Fingertips traced seams that had been sealed with obsessive care. There were no cracks, no leaks. The room refused to answer. Panic did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. A pressure behind the sternum, a tightening at the base of the throat, a sense that something essential had been forgotten just beyond reach. Breathing accelerated, then became irregular as the body attempted to outrun a threat that had no direction. The lack of external stimulus deprived fear of an object, forcing it to expand without boundary. In some cases, this expansion turned violent. Nails scraped against the walls, searching for resistance. Skin tore. Blood appeared, startling in its color, vivid against surfaces that offered no contrast. Pain briefly grounded the mind, introducing sensation where none had existed. But even this faded quickly, absorbed by the silence until injury became another internal signal, indistinguishable from hunger or fatigue. Others moved in the opposite direction. They retreated inward, curling on the floor, minimizing surface area as if trying to disappear from their own awareness. Limbs tucked close, breathing slowed, eyes closed, then reopened when darkness proved no refuge. For these patients, the silence became a weight pressing downward, encouraging stillness, rewarding immobility with a fragile sense of control. The doctor observed all of this without interruption. Hidden apertures allowed him to monitor posture, respiration, and movement. He recorded the exact duration of agitation phases, the transition points between resistance and resignation. His notes were precise, almost tender in their attention to detail. He measured how long it took for breathing to synchronize with the heartbeat, how the body conserved energy once escape seemed impossible. He paid particular attention to the moment when panic ceased to escalate. This moment did not resemble calm. It resembled acceptance. Muscles loosened not from relief, but from calculation. The body learned that struggle wasted resources. Fear, deprived of escalation, folded in on itself and flattened into something colder. This was the threshold. Beyond it, patients entered a state the doctor described as functional surrender. Thoughts narrowed. Attention turned exclusively to immediate sensation. The heart became a metronome. Breath aligned with it, not consciously, but through necessity. The mind, stripped of narrative, operated at a basic level, monitoring internal systems with the vigilance of an organism stripped of environment. Time, at this stage, ceased entirely. There was no anticipation, no memory, only repetition. Heartbeat followed heartbeat. Breath followed breath. Consciousness reduced itself to endurance. The doctor believed this was the corrective state. In his private writings, he compared it to forging metal, the moment when structure gave way under sustained pressure and reformed into something stronger, simpler, less prone to fracture. He argued that the human mind, overwhelmed by its own complexity, required enforced reduction. Silence was the tool that made this possible. Not all patients reached this state cleanly. Some fractured instead. They dissociated, slipping into internal landscapes that replaced silence with hallucinated sound. Whispers emerged, rhythms that did not exist. In extreme cases, entire conversations unfolded without stimulus. The doctor noted these occurrences carefully, adjusting duration in future sessions. He did not view these outcomes as failures, but as calibration errors. The rooms themselves remained unchanged. They absorbed every outburst, every whispered plea, every involuntary sound. They did not echo. They did not respond. They simply waited, allowing the body to exhaust its repertoire of resistance. When the doors finally opened, the return of sound was not comforting. It was invasive. The click of the lock struck like a blow. Footsteps in the corridor felt sharp, excessive, almost painful. Voices, even when low, overwhelmed the senses. Patients flinched. Some covered their ears instinctively, as though the world itself had become hostile. The doctor watched this too. He measured recovery not by relief, but by adaptation. How quickly did the patient tolerate noise? How did the pulse react to overlapping sounds? Did the eyes seek light immediately or hesitate? What mattered most to him was what did not return. The unstructured panic. The runaway thoughts. The ineffable dread that once had no source. These were gone, replaced by a simpler fear, one with clear conditions. Silence had become the enemy. Noise, structure, presence were now safety. Inside the silent rooms, fear had not been destroyed. It had been stripped down, reshaped, and given a new address. And once installed there, deep within the body's most primitive awareness, it proved remarkably difficult to remove. Those who returned from the silent rooms were displayed as evidence. Their transformations were subtle enough to appear dignified, dramatic enough to inspire belief. Formerly trembling hands now held steady cups. Eyes once darting with suspicion fixed calmly on faces and walls. The language of symptoms faded from their records, replaced with terms like remission, resolution, functional stability. Vienna applauded outcomes, not mechanisms, and the clinic supplied outcomes in abundance. Newspapers wrote of courage and modernity, of a city finally shedding medieval superstition in favor of reason. Illustrations showed the clinic as a temple of light and symmetry, its corridors rendered clean and welcoming, its patients smiling with restrained gratitude. Editorials framed the doctor as proof that fear could be conquered without mysticism, that the mind was finally yielding its secrets to orderly hands. Public imagination softened the experience into something almost benevolent. The patients themselves rarely spoke. When they did, their language was careful. Words were chosen sparingly, arranged with the same economy their bodies had learned inside the rooms. They described relief, clarity, control. They described the absence of old terrors, the silence where panic once lived. What they did not describe was what had replaced it, because replacement implied equivalence, and this new condition felt different. Quieter, more intimate, less forgiving. At night, the changes became undeniable. Sleep did not come easily in darkness. The moment lights were extinguished, the body remembered too well what the absence of stimulus demanded. Silence pressed inward, not as peace, but as threat. Many patients began leaving lamps burning until dawn, small pools of light holding the room together. Curtains were drawn back, even in the wealthiest districts, allowing street lamps and moonlight to leak in, breaking the dark into manageable fragments. Sound became essential. Music boxes played on endless rotation. Clocks were placed close enough to be felt through the mattress. Some patients slept beside open windows regardless of season, welcoming the distant rumble of carriages, footsteps on stone, the muffled proof of other lives continuing. Noise was no longer intrusion. It was reassurance. Doctors unrelated to the clinic began to notice the pattern. Patients cured of one fear had acquired another, though it was rarely described that way. They avoided libraries, chapels, remote countryside. Empty rooms caused visible discomfort. Sudden quiet elicited shallow breathing, rigid posture, eyes scanning for anchors that no longer existed. These behaviors were dismissed as minor adjustments, transitional effects of successful treatment. The clinic encouraged this interpretation. Follow-up reports emphasized productivity. Patients returned to work. Marriages stabilized. Public outbursts decreased. There were fewer incidents, fewer crises requiring intervention. Society functioned more smoothly with these newly calibrated minds, and efficiency was persuasive. The fact that many now structured their lives around constant sensory input was considered preference, not pathology. The doctor watched these developments with restrained satisfaction. In his private assessments, he tracked not only symptom reduction but dependency formation. He noted how patients arranged their environments to prevent silence, how their tolerance for unstructured emptiness diminished. He considered this an acceptable trait. Fear, once volatile and unpredictable, had been given a specific shape. It could now be managed externally. He believed this was the mark of success. Some patients attempted to test themselves, to reclaim the stillness they had lost. They sat alone in darkened rooms, extinguished lamps, closed windows. The results were immediate and consistent. Heart rate spiked. Muscles tightened. Thoughts accelerated without direction. The body reacted before the mind could intervene, reliving not memories but conditions. Silence had become synonymous with collapse. These experiments rarely lasted long. Most ended with lights restored, sound reintroduced in desperate increments. Radios turned on at low volume, then higher. Chairs scraped deliberately across floors. Any sensation was preferable to the return of internal noise. The lesson was learned quickly and reinforced nightly. Families noticed changes they could not articulate. Loved ones became vigilant about environment. They rearranged furniture to avoid dead corners, kept doors ajar, filled rooms with texture and movement. Holidays in remote areas were abandoned. Children were discouraged from playing quietly. Silence was treated not as absence, but as hazard. The clinic framed this as adaptation. Modern life, they argued, was loud, illuminated, structured. Those who required constant stimulus were merely better aligned with contemporary conditions. In lectures and papers, the doctor suggested that the future belonged to minds that rejected stillness, that functioned best when engaged and regulated by their surroundings. The idea found support. Factories, offices, and schools were already evolving toward constant activity. Bells signaled transitions. Machines filled gaps between tasks. Even leisure grew noisier, more crowded, less reflective. Patients from the clinic integrated seamlessly into this world, thriving where others struggled. Their need for sound and light mirrored the direction of society itself. What went unacknowledged was the fragility beneath this success. The calm these patients exhibited was conditional. It depended entirely on environment. Remove structure, and the old mechanisms reasserted themselves with ruthless efficiency. Panic no longer spiraled outward, but collapsed inward, compressing thought and sensation into something suffocating. The doctor understood this dependency intimately. He had designed it. In unpublished notes, he wrote that fear did not need to be eliminated to be neutralized. It only needed to be relocated somewhere inconvenient. By binding fear to silence and darkness, he had ensured that patients would avoid both. They would seek engagement, stimulation, supervision. They would remain connected, observable, predictable. From a societal perspective, this was ideal. Criticism did emerge, quietly at first. A handful of physicians questioned the ethics of inducing new vulnerabilities in the process of curing old ones. They spoke of autonomy, of resilience, of the right to inner quiet. Their concerns found little traction. The public preferred results it could measure, and the clinic continued to supply them. Meanwhile, those who had passed through the silent rooms lived carefully constructed lives, illuminated and sonorous, padded against the void they now understood too well. They functioned. They contributed. They slept poorly but woke obediently, ready to move through a world that never stopped speaking. Fear had not disappeared. It had been trained. And like any trained thing, it responded faithfully to its conditioning, rising only when the lights went out and the noise began to fade, waiting patiently for silence to make its move. The doctor was found exactly where he preferred to work, seated upright at his desk in the early hours before dawn. His posture was precise, spine straight, hands resting symmetrically on the polished wood as if interrupted mid-thought. His eyes were open, unfocused yet intent, fixed on a point slightly above the desk surface. There were no signs of struggle, no disturbance in the room. The expression on his face was not fear, nor pain, but concentration sharpened to its final edge. The city responded with ritual efficiency. Death notices framed the event as tragic and sudden, the loss of a brilliant mind at the height of usefulness. Colleagues gathered in hushed groups, speculating about exhaustion, the toll of relentless work. The clinic closed its doors temporarily, curtains drawn, corridors stilled. Silence returned to the building in a way that felt deliberate rather than engineered. It was during the cataloging of his estate that the unease began. Behind a false panel in the study, concealed with the same care as the silent rooms themselves, archivists discovered notebooks never submitted for publication. Their covers were unmarked. Their pages were filled edge to edge with tight, methodical handwriting, unsoftened by academic caution. These were not drafts meant for debate. They were records, confessions, though the word implies remorse, which was absent. The notebooks reframed everything. The doctor wrote that fear was not a malfunction, but a tool improperly deployed. Attempts to soothe it, reason with it, or erase it were misguided. Fear, he argued, could not be destroyed without destabilizing the organism. It could only be repositioned. The purpose of the silent rooms had never been cure. It had been relocation. He described the treatment as recalibration, the deliberate reassignment of fear from abstract uncertainty to a specific, controllable trigger. By forcing patients into an environment stripped of all external reference, he compelled fear to turn inward, to attach itself permanently to the absence of stimulus. Silence became the container, darkness the signal. Everything else, by contrast, became safety. In this state, the mind remained functional, even productive, but only within parameters. The patient would avoid isolation. They would seek structure. They would require supervision, routine, engagement. Spontaneity would diminish. Rebellion would lose appeal. A mind that had survived itself, the doctor wrote, did not romanticize freedom. It valued continuity. He referred to this as stabilization. The notebooks detailed his growing confidence. Early cases were treated cautiously, durations adjusted, observations conservative. As outcomes aligned with prediction, his restraint faded. He wrote of an ideal mental state, one in which fear no longer motivated imagination or dissent, but instead enforced conformity through avoidance. The individual would not challenge systems that provided light, noise, order. Gratitude would replace resistance. The most disturbing passages concern scale. The doctor speculated about broader application, not merely clinical but cultural. He wrote that modern society already trended towards sensory saturation, constant illumination, perpetual motion. His work did not oppose this trajectory, it refined it. By conditioning individuals to associate silence with collapse, he ensured alignment with an increasingly structured world. Fear became an ally of progress. One passage, underlined heavily, described control not as force but as dependency. A controlled mind did not feel imprisoned. It felt protected. It would defend its constraints, fearing the alternative more than domination itself. The clinic's board attempted to suppress the notebooks. Portions were confiscated. Others leaked slowly, selectively, diluted by professional language and cautious summaries. Yet the core argument circulated among those trained to recognize it. This was not therapy. It was conditioning. Former patients were re-examined with new attention. Their lives, once models of recovery, revealed uniformity. Similar routines, similar aversions, similar responses to disruption. They functioned well, but only within environments dense with stimulus. Remove that density, and cracks appeared immediately. The doctor's death itself took on new meaning. A junior assistant recalled that the study had been modified shortly before the end. Additional insulation installed, gaps sealed, ventilation dampened to eliminate even the faintest hum. The doctor had requested solitude during those hours, refusing interruption. He had been conducting a final trial on himself. In the notebook's final pages, the handwriting grew tighter, more compressed. He described incremental exposure, increasing durations of silence beyond those prescribed to patients. He wrote of familiarity replacing discomfort, of internal rhythms becoming orderly. He believed himself uniquely suited to complete the experiment, convinced that understanding granted immunity. The last entry ended mid-sentence. There was no conclusion, no reflection, only a break in ink where the hand had stopped moving. Speculation followed. Some claimed he had achieved his aim, entering a state of perfect internal regulation. Others suggested miscalculation, that even he had underestimated the cost. Official reports cited natural causes, a failure of the heart under strain. The irony was noted privately and ignored publicly. The clinic reopened months later under new leadership. Procedures were revised. Language softened. The silent rooms remained, though access became restricted. Demand did not diminish. The results were still too valuable. Vienna moved on, absorbing the revelation without transformation. Progress, once embraced, rarely retreats. The notebooks were archived, then forgotten, their conclusions diffused into practice without attribution. The idea endured even as the author faded. Fear had never been cured. It had been domesticated, taught where to reside and when to awaken. The doctor had proven his theory completely, at the cost of his own silence. Those who passed through his rooms continued to live illuminated lives, tethered gently but firmly to sound and presence. They did not rebel. They did not withdraw. They functioned. And in the quiet hours, when noise thinned and lights dimmed, the truth waited patiently inside them, exactly where it had been placed, listening for the world to go still again. The clinic stood empty for months before the decision was made to dismantle it, a building once celebrated for its rationality, now condemned by whispers of obsession and cruelty. Workers arrived with tools and lamps, moving through corridors that had once welcomed the city's elite, noting the unnatural quiet that still clung to the walls. The air was heavy, thick with decades of compressed breath, the metallic tang of anxiety that no cleaning or ventilation could erase. As layers of flooring and paneling were removed, the scale of the doctor's devotion to silence became horrifyingly evident. The walls were revealed to be far thicker than any architectural plans had suggested, composites of felt, lead, and pulverized bone that absorbed every trace of sound. Each panel fit with a precision that denied casual measurement, edges merging without seam, corners aligned as if the building itself had been designed to reject echoes. The workers spoke in whispers, not out of courtesy, but because even their own voices felt intrusive in the oppressive quiet. Every step on the polished wood or stone floor produced no reflection of noise, only the faintest vibration underfoot, like the building's memory of motion. Beneath the floors, hidden compartments were found, long, narrow chambers, barely large enough for a single adult to stand or crouch, each containing remnants of prolonged habitation. Dust patterns suggested that objects had been moved repeatedly, small piles of personal items arranged meticulously, ashes of candles burned down to stubs, and scraps of food carefully rationed. In some, crude bedding of straw and cloth remained, marked by the imprint of bodies shaped over nights of complete, unbroken silence. Each chamber felt like a shrine to an experiment conducted not on others, but first and foremost on the doctor himself. Signs of obsessive repetition were everywhere. Measurements etched into lead linings, annotations in margins of panels, tally marks carved discreetly into the wooden frames of doors, traces of monitoring, timing, recording the body's responses to hours, then days, then weeks of deprivation. The atmosphere suggested a rhythm beyond human comprehension, a precision that merged physiology with architecture, where walls, floors, and ceilings were instruments tuned to capture every heartbeat, every inhalation, every tremor of muscle. It was not merely a laboratory. It was a confession pressed into material form, a testament to control and endurance taken to extremes no one outside these rooms could imagine. In one chamber, a worker uncovered a journal, its leather cracked and pages yellowed, placed deliberately, as if to be found only at the building's dismantling. The entries chronicled long nights spent alone, the progression of silence as a tool, the strategies used to internalize every external sensation until nothing remained but the internal rhythm of life. There were passages describing panic waves that rose when even the faintest sound dared intrude, and methods developed to force the heart to command attention over thought. The doctor had tested these methods on himself first, recording every physiological change, noting the point at which mind and body could no longer differentiate time, space, or presence, until the organism existed entirely within the private chamber of its own perception. It became clear that the final sound the doctor ever experienced was his own heartbeat, amplified by the stillness he had cultivated over years. Each chamber beneath the floors had been a rehearsal, a calibration, a trial of endurance where the external world was stripped away, leaving only the body's internal signals to dictate reality. He had endured the crescendo of fear until it folded neatly into obedience, until instinct became compliance, until the rhythm of blood through arteries and veins replaced the chorus of daily life. He returned night after night to perfect this silence, isolating himself to the point where no human contact, no city noise, no incidental clatter could penetrate his focus. Workers noted traces of his presence in the upper rooms as well. Surfaces worn smooth where he had paced, indentations in rugs where he had knelt or crouched, faint discoloration in paint where hands had rested for balance or measurement. The meticulous attention to detail extended to every level, suggesting that the doctor did not merely conduct experiments. He lived within them, embodied them, became inseparable from the silence he so carefully crafted. The very architecture of the clinic was inseparable from his method, a symphony of control rendered in lead, wood, bone, and breath. The implications were chilling. Those who had entered his silent rooms had been subjected to techniques he had already endured, tested, perfected on himself. Every procedure documented in notebooks, every modification to the building, every whispered annotation was evidence that he had anticipated human reaction with ruthless accuracy. Survival, or so it seemed, was not a matter of courage, but of enduring a structure, a system, a precise orchestration of fear that had been perfected in one solitary, obsessive mind before it was imposed on others. The final horror was psychological as well as physical. Even after the dismantling, the silence that had been engineered did not entirely dissipate. Workers reported the faintest echoes of internal heartbeat when standing alone, a low pulse that seemed to rise from the floors themselves, an afterimage of presence. Some left the site trembling, lamps clutched against chests, compelled to create noise even in empty rooms. It was as though the doctor's calibration had transcended his body, embedding itself in the very materials he had manipulated, a memory of meticulous isolation that outlived him, waiting for any listener willing to notice the absence of sound. By the time the final panel was removed and the last chamber revealed, the conclusion was inescapable. The doctor had not merely treated fear. He had mapped it, internalized it, and weaponized it against the self, leaving a blueprint of control that would endure beyond his own death. The narrow chambers, the leaded walls, the felt and bone dust, the journals, they were all evidence of a man who sought to confront existence by erasing all else from perception, until the body's own signals became the only reality. The heartbeat that had followed him in life continued to follow him in memory, echoing silently through walls that knew every inch of his obsession, every whisper of compliance, every measure of endurance. The final discovery left those present with a conviction that survived rational explanation. Silence had a shape, a texture, a gravity of its own. The doctor had proven it, felt it, lived it, and imposed it upon the living. And when the last lamp was extinguished, the building finally void of human activity, the faint, impossible rhythm of that perfected silence lingered in the empty corridors, pressing against ears, lungs, and minds, insisting that the experiment was never truly over.